Ethan Caldwell had everything that most people dreamed of. His mansion stood on the edge of the city, shining like a piece of glass under the sun. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and the garden looked like something out of a magazine. The people who worked for him made sure that every blade of grass stayed perfect, that every marble floor reflected light like a mirror. To anyone passing by, it seemed like Ethan's life was flawless. But inside those walls there was something colder than stone, an emptiness that money couldn't fill. Ethan had built his fortune through years of business deals, the kind that made other people lose sleep while he stayed calm and calculating. He liked control, perfection, and power. He liked the way people looked at him when he walked into a room. To him, being feared was close enough to being respected. His mansion was full of people, maids, cooks, drivers, gardeners, but he never really saw them. They were just part of the house, like furniture that moved and spoke. He didn't know their names, didn't ask about their lives. As long as they did their work, he was satisfied. Every morning, Ethan would sit in the sunroom, sipping coffee that cost more than what some people earned in a week. He liked to read the financial pages while the staff worked quietly around him. One of them was a woman who had only recently started working there. She was quiet and polite, never drawing attention to herself. Her name was Maria. She cleaned the rooms with care, always moving quickly so she wouldn't be noticed. Maria came from a small town a few hours away. Life had not been easy for her. She'd taken the job because it paid better than anything else she could find, and she needed the money to help her younger brother finish school. She didn't complain, didn't talk much, and tried her best to stay invisible. That was how people like her stayed out of trouble in houses like this. But there was something about her that didn't quite fit the picture of a maid. The way she walked, the way her eyes studied everything around her. There was calmness and something else too, something like sadness mixed with quiet strength. She seemed like someone who had known more than cleaning floors and polishing silver. One morning, while dusting the grand piano in the drawing room, Maria paused. The piano was the centerpiece of the room, a glossy black instrument that hadn't been played in years. She ran her cloth across its smooth surface and looked at the keys. Her fingers itched slightly, almost as if they remembered something, but she stopped herself and continued her work. She didn't notice that Ethan, standing in the doorway, had seen her hesitation. Ethan rarely entered that room, but he liked to inspect things when he was bored. "Do you play?" he asked suddenly. Maria froze, startled that he was speaking to her directly. "No, sir," she said quickly, looking down. He narrowed his eyes. "You looked like you wanted to." "I was just cleaning, sir." He said nothing more and walked away, but for some reason that short moment stayed with him. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because she hadn't stuttered or smiled nervously like most of his staff did when he spoke to them. She had simply answered quietly and gone back to her work. In the days that followed, Ethan began to notice her more often. Not intentionally at first, but she seemed to appear everywhere. Arranging flowers, polishing the staircase railing, carrying laundry. She worked longer hours than anyone else and never complained. Sometimes he caught her glancing at the piano again, but she never touched it. He wondered what her story was, though he wouldn't admit that to himself. Ethan didn't care about people's stories. He believed everyone had choices, and those who didn't make it had simply failed. But something about the quiet way Maria carried herself, like she was holding her own pieces together, made him curious. One evening, Ethan hosted one of his usual dinner parties. His friends were mostly other business owners, people who talked loudly, drank expensive wine, and laughed at things that weren't funny. The mansion buzzed with music, light, and the sound of clinking glasses. The guests filled the drawing room, and once again, the grand piano sat in the corner untouched and silent. "Ethan," one of the guests said with a grin, "you have this beautiful piano and no one ever plays it." "What a waste," Ethan shrugged. "I don't play. I just like how it looks." Another guest, already tipsy, chuckled. "Maybe your staff can give us a tune. I saw your maid dusting it earlier. She looked like she wanted to play." The table burst into laughter. Ethan smirked, the corner of his mouth curling slightly. "Maybe she can," he said, half amused. "She might surprise us." The comment was meant as a joke, but his words carried a sharp edge. He liked moments like this, when he could remind people who was in charge. When Maria entered the room a few minutes later to serve drinks, the conversation stopped. The guests exchanged playful looks. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said casually, Maria, do you know how to play the piano? Her hand stiffened around the tray she was holding. No, sir, she said softly. Come now, one of the women said with a teasing smile. Don't be shy. Play us something simple. I don't think, Maria began, but Ethan interrupted. It's fine, Maria. Just play something, anything, let's see what happens. The room fell quiet. Maria looked around, her face pale. She wanted to refuse, but she knew better. In this house, saying no could cost her the job she desperately needed. So she nodded slowly and walked toward the piano. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat on the bench. Everyone watched with amusement. Ethan folded his arms, expecting a few wrong notes and a good laugh afterward. The only sound in the room was the faint crackle of the fireplace. Maria placed her fingers on the keys, but she didn't press down. Her mind flashed back to another time, another room, smaller but filled with warmth. Her father had taught her to play when she was a child. He'd saved for months to buy her a second-hand keyboard. She used to play for hours, dreaming that one day she would perform on a real stage. But that dream had vanished years ago when her family lost everything. Now sitting there, surrounded by people waiting to laugh, she felt the weight of all those lost years pressing on her chest. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, just once more. Her fingers began to move gently across the keys, just testing the sound. The piano was slightly out of tune, but it was still beautiful. She didn't play a full song, just a few notes, soft and trembling. Then she stopped, stood up, and said quietly, I'm sorry, sir. I shouldn't have touched it. The guests chuckled. Ethan waved his hand. That's fine. You can go. Maria nodded and left the room quickly, her heart beating fast. She could hear laughter behind her as she walked down the hallway. She wanted to disappear, but instead, she went to the kitchen and continued working, her hands shaking slightly. For Ethan, the moment was forgotten as soon as the laughter faded. But later that night, after the guests had gone and the house grew quiet, he walked past the piano again. Something made him stop. He sat on the same bench where Maria had been and touched the keys. A faint warmth still lingered there, as if her touch had left a trace. He pressed one key and the note echoed softly in the empty room. He didn't know why, but the sound felt different tonight. He looked at the piano for a long time before turning off the lights and walking upstairs. The next morning, Maria arrived early as always. She cleaned the same rooms, polished the same surfaces, and said nothing about what had happened. But deep inside, she felt something stirring again, a quiet reminder of who she used to be, of what she once loved. Ethan saw her once that morning from the balcony as she carried a bucket of water to the garden. He almost said something but stopped himself. He wasn't sure what he would even say. He didn't apologize, he never did. But something about the memory of her sitting at the piano wouldn't leave him. And though neither of them knew it yet, that small, awkward moment was about to change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The next few days passed quietly in the mansion. The grand piano sat untouched again, its glossy surface catching the morning light through the wide windows. To anyone else, it looked like part of the furniture, silent and elegant. But for Maria, every time she walked past it, she felt something inside her stir. It was as if the piano called to her in a voice only she could hear, reminding her of something she had buried long ago. She tried to ignore it. Her job was to clean, not to dream. Dreams didn't pay the bills, and they certainly didn't help her family. Every day she woke up before sunrise, took the first bus, and arrived at the mansion while the sky was still pale blue. She worked through the long hours, polishing the silverware, dusting the shelves, and making sure everything stayed in perfect order. She never complained, never asked for more, and never expected kindness. But that night at the dinner party had changed something in her. She had felt embarrassed when they laughed, yes, but beneath that, she also felt something she hadn't in a long time, a pull toward the piano, a tiny spark that refused to die out. Ethan, on the other hand, had tried to move on from the incident, but he couldn't shake the memory. He remembered how Maria's hands had rested on the keys, how for a brief second her posture had changed. There had been a calmness in her, something he couldn't quite explain. He found himself thinking about it more than he liked. One afternoon, he was sitting in his study when his friend Robert came to visit. Robert was one of those men who always had something to say about everything. They talked about business, stocks, and the usual matters of power and money. But soon Robert brought up the dinner party. You know, Robert said, laughing, that maid of yours, I can't believe you made her play the piano. That was cruel, Ethan. Ethan smirked. I didn't make her. It was a joke. Still, Robert said, sipping his drink. She looked terrified. You really should give her a break. Ethan shrugged, pretending not to care, but the comment bothered him. He didn't like the idea of being seen as cruel, even though deep down he knew there was truth in it. After Robert left, Ethan found himself walking to the drawing room again. He stood in front of the piano for a long moment, staring at it. He pressed one key. The sound was soft, lonely, and somehow comforting. He wondered what it would sound like if Maria really played. Maria, meanwhile, was in the kitchen helping the cook prepare dinner. She worked quietly, as she always did, but her mind drifted to the sound of the keys. She hadn't played properly in years. Back in her hometown, before everything fell apart, she used to practice every day after school. Her father would sit beside her, smiling proudly. He'd always said, music doesn't ask who you are or how much you have. It just asks what's inside your heart. She missed those days. Life had been hard, but at least it had meaning then. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Maria lingered in the drawing room to tidy up. The moonlight spilled across the piano, making it glow softly in the dark. She looked around. The house was quiet. She hesitated, then sat down. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Just one song, she told herself. No one would hear. She pressed a key and then another. The sound filled the room like a whisper. Slowly, her hands began to move with more confidence. The music was gentle at first, then fuller, deeper, carrying emotion she hadn't been able to speak for years. She played a melody she remembered from her childhood, a soft, flowing tune her father had taught her. As she played, her worries melted away. For a few minutes, she wasn't a maid in a stranger's house. She was herself again, the girl who had believed she could become a pianist. She didn't realize that someone else was awake. Ethan had been in his study, unable to sleep. He had opened the window for some air when he heard the faint sound of music drifting through the hallway. He frowned, wondering who it could be. The sound grew clearer as he followed it, notes that rose and fell like a heartbeat. When he reached the drawing room, he stopped in the doorway. There she was, Maria, sitting at the piano, eyes closed, completely lost in the music. The moonlight touched her face and the keys reflected in her eyes. Her hands moved gracefully, confidently, as if they belonged there. For the first time, Ethan didn't see a maid. He saw a musician. He didn't say a word. He stood there, frozen, listening. The melody wrapped around him like a story, sad but beautiful. Something stirred deep inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. When the music finally stopped, Maria sighed and wiped her eyes. Ethan stepped forward slowly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked quietly. Maria gasped and stood up, startled. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. I was just—" "Relax," he said, his tone softer than usual. "I asked you a question." She looked down. "My father taught me, when I was a child." "You lied when I asked if you could play," he said. "I was afraid," she whispered. "I didn't want to lose my job." Ethan studied her for a moment. He wasn't angry. In fact, he felt something like guilt. "You won't lose it," he said finally. "That was incredible." Maria blinked in surprise. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. He nodded and walked away without another word, but that night he couldn't sleep. The sound of her music echoed in his mind. He realized that for years he had filled his house with everything money could buy, but it had always been silent. And now, that silence had been broken by a maid, a woman he had barely noticed before. The next morning, Ethan's routine felt different. The house didn't seem as cold. He caught himself glancing toward the piano more than once. Maria tried to avoid him as usual, embarrassed that he had caught her playing. She didn't know what he thought of her now. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he pitied her. She didn't want pity, only respect. But later that afternoon, while she was cleaning the library, Ethan appeared in the doorway. "You play beautifully," he said simply. She looked up, surprised. "Thank you, sir. You stopped playing because of—" "What? Life?" Maria smiled sadly. "Because of life, yes. My father died. My family lost everything. I had to work. Music doesn't feed you, sir. Not when you're poor." Ethan didn't know what to say. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. All his wealth, his luxury, none of it could buy what she had in her hands: genuine talent, emotion, and humility. Would you play again sometime? He asked quietly. She hesitated. If you wish, sir. He nodded. I do. From that day, something changed between them. Ethan began to see Maria not just as a maid, but as a person. He didn't know why her music affected him so deeply, but it did. Sometimes he found himself waiting in the evenings just to hear her play again. Maria, on her part, didn't understand him either. He was still proud and distant, but there was something softer in his voice now. He no longer looked through her. He looked at her. One night, as she played a slow, tender piece, Ethan sat quietly near the window, pretending to read but really listening. He realized that her music made the house feel alive, and for the first time in years, he felt human again. Days turned into weeks, and life in the mansion quietly changed. The people who worked there began to notice it too. The air didn't feel as cold anymore. The strict silence that used to hang over the halls had softened. The reason for that was simple. The piano was no longer silent. Almost every evening, when the sun slipped below the horizon and the house began to rest, soft music filled the air. Sometimes it was gentle and slow, like a whisper. Other times it carried sadness, deep and haunting. It came from the drawing room where Maria sat at the piano, her hands moving carefully across the keys. Ethan often listened without saying a word. He would stay near the door or sit by the window, pretending to read or work. But in truth, he was listening, truly listening, and for the first time in years. He couldn't understand how someone who had so little could bring out such emotion from an instrument he had owned for so long, but never touched. At first, he told himself it was just curiosity. He wanted to understand how she'd learned, how she played with such feeling. But as days went by, curiosity turned into something deeper, a quiet admiration. Maria, on the other hand, never asked why he allowed her to play. She simply played because it made her feel alive again. The music gave her peace, and it helped her forget the long hours of work, the ache in her hands, the worries waiting outside those walls. She didn't think of herself as special. She only thought of her father, of the simple joy that came from pressing those keys and creating something beautiful. One afternoon, Ethan invited a few of his business partners to the house. They were men who valued money and success above all else, the kind of men Ethan had spent years trying to impress. They sat in the grand dining room talking about profits, properties, and new investments. Their laughter echoed across the hall. As they talked, one of them noticed the piano in the drawing room and said with a smirk, "You still keep that thing around? I remember someone saying you bought it just for decoration." Ethan gave a small smile. "It's useful now." "Useful? How so?" the man asked. Before Ethan could answer, Maria appeared quietly at the doorway carrying a tray of drinks. She placed it gently on the table, bowed slightly, and began to leave. Ethan looked at her, then back at his guests. "Actually," he said casually, "she plays." The men laughed. "Your maid?" one of them said, amused. "You're joking." "I'm not," Ethan replied. "She plays the piano?" Another said, clearly entertained. "Now that's something I'd pay to see." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Then stay a few minutes. You'll see for free." Maria froze where she stood. Her heart began to race. She looked at Ethan, silently asking if he was serious. "Go ahead, Maria," he said softly. But with that same confident tone she remembered from the first night he had teased her in front of guests. "Play something." The men chuckled, expecting a show. Maria hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse. She still remembered how humiliated she had felt before. But another part of her trusted that this time was different. Ethan's expression wasn't cruel. It was calm, almost encouraging. She nodded slowly, walked toward the piano, and sat down. The room grew quiet. Even the laughter faded. Maria took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. She began to play a piece she loved, a slow, emotional melody that told a story without words. The sound filled the room, soft at first, then stronger. The men stopped smiling. They looked at each other, surprised. The music carried emotion they couldn't explain. It was beautiful, deep, and full of something real. The kind of beauty that couldn't be bought or measured. When the song ended, there was silence for a moment before the room broke into polite applause. "Impressive," one of the men said. "You didn't say you had a musician on your staff." Ethan smiled faintly. "I didn't know until recently." The men laughed again, but this time not at Maria. They laughed awkwardly, unsure what to say. Maria stood quietly and bowed slightly before leaving the room. Her heart was pounding. As she walked down the hallway, she felt both nervous and proud. She hadn't played for strangers since she was a teenager. She never thought she would again. After the guests left that evening, Ethan found her in the kitchen washing dishes. "You played beautifully," he said. She looked up, surprised to see him there. "Thank you, sir." They were speechless, he continued. "You have no idea what kind of effect you have when you play." Maria smiled shyly. "I only play because I love it. I didn't think it would matter to anyone else." Ethan shook his head. "It matters. Sometimes more than you think." That night he sat alone in the drawing room long after everyone had gone to bed. He thought about how he had spent his life chasing money and recognition. But when Maria played, none of that seemed important. Her music reached places inside him that he had ignored for years. He remembered his childhood, long before he had become the man everyone respected and feared. He used to love music once, not playing it but listening. His mother had played the piano in their small home, singing softly as she did. After she passed away, he had buried those memories along with his emotions, replacing them with ambition and work. But Maria's playing had brought it all back. The next morning, Ethan asked Maria to come to the study. She entered nervously, wondering if she had done something wrong. "I have a proposal," he said. "Yes, sir? I'm hosting another charity dinner next month. It's for the Arts Foundation. I'd like you to play during the event." Her eyes widened. "Me? But I'm just a maid, sir." "People wouldn't—" He raised a hand gently. "They will listen. And they'll remember." Maria shook her head. "I don't know, sir. I'm not ready for something like that." "You're more than ready," he said firmly. "You just don't believe it yet." She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to accept, but fear held her back. She had lived too long thinking she wasn't meant for more than cleaning and surviving. Ethan seemed to sense her hesitation. "Think about it," he said softly. "You don't have to answer now." As she left the study, Maria felt torn. The idea of performing again filled her with both excitement and dread. But deep down, she knew she wanted to do it, not for him but for herself. Over the next few days, she practiced quietly whenever she could. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night. Her fingers hurt and she made mistakes, but she kept going. The music gave her courage. It reminded her of her father's words, that music came from the heart, not the circumstances. Ethan often passed by and listened, though he pretended not to. He didn't want to distract her, but he couldn't help admiring her dedication. There was something pure about it, something he hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. One evening, as she was practicing, she noticed him standing by the door. "You should rest." "Sir?" she said with a small smile. He smiled back faintly. "Maybe. But your music makes it hard to leave." She laughed softly, a sound so light it surprised even her. "I didn't know you liked music." "I didn't, not anymore," he admitted, "until you reminded me why it matters." That night, as she played one final song, Ethan realized that his house, once silent and cold, now felt alive. The music didn't just fill the rooms. It filled something inside him that had been empty for far too long. He didn't know it yet, but Maria's presence was slowly changing him, teaching him that not all wealth could be counted in money or things. Some came from the heart. The day of the charity dinner arrived faster than anyone expected. The mansion buzzed with quiet preparation. Workers set up long tables covered in white linen, candles glowed in tall glass holders, and waiters carried trays of sparkling glasses. The sound of clinking silverware and low conversation filled the air. The event was one of the biggest Ethan had hosted in years, and he wanted everything to be perfect. But this time something was different. The evening wasn't just about money or business. For the first time, it was also about music. Ethan had decided to let Maria perform in front of his guests. He didn't tell her at first how important it was to him, but deep down he knew this night meant more than any deal he'd ever made. Maria, on the other hand, was nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the flowers on the piano. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. All her life she had worked quietly in the background. Tonight would be different. Tonight people would look at her, listen to her, and judge her. She stood in front of the piano, her heart racing. She had practiced for weeks in secret, waking early and staying late after her chores were done. She wanted to play perfectly, not because she cared about the rich guests, but because she wanted to make her father proud. In her small room upstairs, she took a deep breath and looked at the simple photograph she kept by her bed, a faded picture of her father smiling beside an old keyboard. "I'll do my best," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Downstairs, guests began to arrive. Expensive cars lined the driveway and laughter filled the grand hall. The guests, dressed in shimmering gowns and dark suits, exchanged greetings and compliments. Ethan moved among them with calm confidence, but his thoughts kept drifting toward the piano. He had spent years building his reputation as a hard, emotionless businessman, but tonight he wanted something else. He wanted to feel proud of something real. He didn't fully understand why, but Maria's music had touched something in him that no amount of wealth ever could. When the dinner began, the guests settled around the long table. The chandeliers sparkled above them. Waiters served delicate dishes while conversation flowed easily. Ethan stood and raised his glass for attention. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Tonight we gather not just to support the arts, but to remember why art matters. It reminds us of who we are." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the piano. "We have a special performance tonight. Someone who works in this house. Someone whose talent deserves to be heard." The guests turned, curious. Some whispered to each other. Ethan continued, "Please welcome Maria." The room went still as she stepped forward. Her simple dress looked modest but graceful. Her hands shook slightly, but her eyes were calm. She bowed politely before sitting at the piano. For a moment she hesitated. The sound of soft whispers filled her ears. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her. Then she remembered her father's voice. "Music comes from the heart. Close your eyes if you must, but play with truth." She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The first notes floated gently into the air, clear and pure. Slowly, the room grew silent. The guests who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. The melody was tender and sad, but filled with hope. Her fingers moved gracefully, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Ethan watched her closely. There was something powerful in the way she played, something raw and honest. He could see her emotion in every movement, every note. It wasn't just talent. It was life, pain, and love woven into sound. As the song continued, a quiet hush fell over the entire hall. Even the waiters froze, holding their trays still. Some guests closed their eyes. Others stared in disbelief. Many of them had attended countless events with polished performers, but none had ever heard anything that felt so human. When the last note faded, the silence lasted a long time. Then slowly applause began. It grew louder until the room filled with clapping and cheers. Maria stood, bowed slightly, and smiled shyly. Her eyes glistened, but she held herself with quiet dignity. Ethan felt something heavy lift inside him. He hadn't expected to feel proud, not just of her, but of what she represented. For the first time, he felt that the money he had spent on this event actually meant something. After the applause died down, guests began to approach Maria with kind words. "That was stunning," one woman said, her voice warm. "You played beautifully. Where did you learn?" Another asked. Maria smiled politely. "My father taught me when I was young." Ethan watched her from a distance. She handled every compliment with grace and humility. There was no pride in her, no arrogance, only gratitude. Later that night, when the guests had left and the house was quiet again, Maria found Ethan standing by the window in the drawing room. The moonlight reflected softly off the piano. "You were wonderful," he said, turning toward her. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice soft. "I was very nervous." "I could tell at first," he said with a small smile. "But then you forgot about the room, didn't you?" She nodded. "When I play, I stop thinking. It's just me and the music." He looked at her for a long moment. "You reminded me of something tonight," he said quietly. "That there's more to life than success and money. I think I had forgotten that for a long time." Maria smiled gently. "Maybe music helps us remember." Ethan nodded, lost in thought. For years he had lived surrounded by wealth but starved of meaning. Tonight, a maid's music had filled that emptiness. As days passed after the event, things slowly shifted in the mansion. Ethan became kinder to his staff. He greeted them, asked about their days, and even thanked them for their work, something he had never done before. People noticed the change, though no one dared to ask what had caused it. Maria continued her duties as usual, but she could feel the difference too. The house no longer felt as heavy. There was warmth in the air and laughter returned in small ways. One afternoon, Ethan called Maria into his study. She entered nervously, unsure why he had asked for her. "I spoke with the director of the city's art foundation," he said. "They hold free performances every month to support local talent. I told them about you." Maria's eyes widened. "You told them?" "Yes," he said simply. "They want you to play next month." Her heart skipped a beat. "Sir, I can't. I'm not a professional." You are a musician," he interrupted gently. "And the world deserves to hear you." She didn't know what to say. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly looked down. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Just play. That's enough." The next few weeks became a blur of preparation. Ethan made sure she had time to practice and even had the piano tuned professionally. Sometimes he would sit quietly in the background listening as she rehearsed. Every song she played seemed to tell a different story, sometimes of loss, sometimes of hope. And with every note, Ethan found himself changing a little more. On the night of the city performance, the hall was filled with people. Maria stood backstage, nervous but determined. Ethan was there too, standing near the front row. When their eyes met, he gave her a reassuring nod. When she stepped on stage and began to play, the entire hall went silent, just as it had in the mansion. Her music floated like light, reaching every corner of the room. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet in applause. Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, pride that wasn't tied to success, but to the beauty of someone else's courage. That night, as they drove back home, he looked out the window at the quiet streets and said softly, "You've changed more than this house. Maria, you've changed me." She looked at him, surprised, and smiled. "Sometimes all it takes is one song, sir." And in that moment, both of them knew. The piano that had once been just decoration had become something far greater. It had brought back humanity, kindness, and a reminder that true worth isn't measured by wealth but by the heart. After the performance at the City Hall, life began to change for both Ethan and Maria in quiet but meaningful ways. People who had attended that evening couldn't stop talking about the mysterious young woman who had played the piano so beautifully. The newspapers mentioned her in small columns, describing her music as soulful and pure. Some even wrote that her performance was the highlight of the night. For Maria, all of it felt like a dream she hadn't asked for. She went back to her usual chores at the mansion, sweeping, cleaning, and organizing like before. But deep inside, she felt something new, a small spark of hope. For years, she had accepted that her life would never be more than service and silence. But now she knew she had something the world could feel, her music. Ethan noticed the change in her, too. She moved with more confidence, spoke with a softer kind of strength. Her eyes, once tired and unsure, now held a light that he hadn't seen before. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the piano after finishing her work. The sunlight spilled through the tall windows, and the keys glimmered like ivory stars. He asked quietly, "Do you still practice every day?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. It helps me feel alive," he smiled faintly. "Good, you should never stop." For a while, he simply stood there, listening to her play. Her music filled the room, gentle and full of life. It reminded him of something he had almost forgotten: peace. Ethan's business life was still as demanding as ever, but the emptiness he used to feel had softened. He began spending less time chasing deals and more time at home, listening to Maria play in the evenings. It became their silent ritual. She played and he listened. One day, after a long piece, he said, "You've given this house something money never could." Maria looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "Warmth," he replied simply. "For years, this place was cold. Beautiful, yes, but lifeless. Now it feels like home." She blushed slightly and looked away. "That means a lot to hear, sir." He studied her for a moment, realizing how much she had changed his view of the world. For most of his life, he had measured worth in numbers: profits, investments, returns. But now, for the first time, he understood that some things couldn't be measured at all. As weeks went by, more invitations arrived for Maria to perform at small events and gatherings. Ethan encouraged her to accept them. He even arranged transportation and made sure she had a proper dress to wear. At first, Maria was hesitant. She didn't want people to think she had forgotten where she came from. But Ethan assured her, "You're not leaving who you are behind. You're sharing it with others." Her performances began to draw small crowds. People admired her not only for her skill, but also for her humility. She never spoke much during these events. She simply let her music speak for her. Each melody carried a piece of her story: quiet struggle, hope, and gratitude. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself reflecting more deeply on his own life. His wealth, once his greatest pride, no longer gave him joy. He started visiting local charities, sponsoring young musicians who couldn't afford instruments. It felt strange at first, giving without expecting anything in return, but also right. One evening after Maria returned from a concert, Ethan invited her to the library. He was sitting near the fireplace with 2 cups of tea. "Sit," he said with a kind smile. She hesitated, unsure if she should. "Sir, please," he interrupted softly. "Just for a moment." She sat across from him, her hands resting on her lap. The fire crackled between them. "I want to ask you something," he began. "If you could do anything in this world, anything at all, what would it be?" Maria thought for a moment. "I'd like to teach music to children who can't afford lessons," she said finally. "There are so many with talent, but they never get a chance." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's a beautiful dream." "I don't know if it will ever happen," she said quietly, "but I can dream." He looked at her with a thoughtful expression. Sometimes dreams just need someone to believe in them. She smiled, not realizing what he truly meant. Over the next few months, Ethan began making quiet plans. He met with people from the local music academy and spoke about starting a scholarship program. He wanted Maria to be part of it, not as a worker, but as an instructor. But he didn't tell her yet. He wanted it to be a surprise. During that time, Maria continued to grow as a musician. Her confidence bloomed, but her heart stayed humble. She still did her work at the mansion, never asking for special treatment. For her, music was never about fame or praise. It was about expression, about keeping her father's memory alive. One evening, after a small concert, she returned home to find Ethan waiting for her at the piano. "You were wonderful tonight," he said sincerely. "Thank you, sir," she replied with a soft smile. "I've been thinking," he said. "Do you ever feel that you're meant for something bigger than this house?" She hesitated. "Sometimes. But I also feel grateful for what I have. You've been kind to me in this place. It gave me a second chance," Ethan nodded. "You've given me one too." For a moment, silence filled the room. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then he said, "Maria, I've arranged something. There's a music school opening soon, one that offers free lessons for children who can't afford them. I've spoken to the director. They'd like you to lead the beginner classes." She froze, unsure if she had heard him right. "Me, teach?" "Yes," he said with a small smile. "You've inspired me to start this. And I can't think of anyone better to guide those children than you." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied gently. "That's all." She wiped her tears and nodded. "Yes, I'll do it." He smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't known in years. Over the next few weeks, they worked together to prepare the school. Ethan provided funding, and Maria helped design the small classroom space. Bright, welcoming, filled with second-hand instruments that were polished and tuned with care. The opening day was modest but beautiful. A few families came with their children, most shy and uncertain. Maria greeted each one with a kind smile, assuring them that talent didn't depend on money. When she sat at the piano and played the first notes for her new students, Ethan watched from the doorway. He didn't need applause or recognition. Seeing her there, happy and fulfilled, was enough. The school grew slowly, but it became something special. Children who once had no access to instruments now spent their afternoons learning to play. Their laughter and music filled the small hall, echoing with life. And Maria, once a maid who played the piano in secret, became the heart of it all. Ethan often visited, sitting quietly in the back watching her teach. Every time he felt proud, and not of his money, but of the difference it had made when guided by kindness. One afternoon, as the children packed up their instruments and left, Maria approached him. "I used to think music was my escape," she said softly, "but now I see it's my gift to share." He nodded. "And you've shared it beautifully," she smiled. "Thank you for believing in me." He looked at her with genuine warmth. "You believed first. I just finally learned how to listen." As the sun set behind the classroom windows, painting the walls in shades of gold, the room filled once more with the faint sound of piano keys. The music wasn't grand or polished, but it was full of life, the sound of hope, of second chances, of two souls who had found meaning where they least expected it. That evening, as they locked up and walked back toward the car, Ethan said quietly, "I think your father would be proud." Maria looked up at the sky, her eyes shining softly. "I think he'd say the same about you." And as they drove away, the last light of day fading behind them, the world outside seemed quieter, not because it lacked sound, but because everything that needed to be said was already spoken through the music they had shared. Months passed, and the music school became a small but bright corner of the city. The sound of piano keys, laughter, and singing filled the halls every afternoon. Children who had once walked through life quietly now carried melodies in their hearts. Maria stood at the center of it all, her eyes glowing with pride and warmth. Each child reminded her of her younger self, the little girl who had once dreamed of music while washing dishes and sweeping floors. Now she was helping others find their voices just as her father once helped her. Ethan visited often. He never made grand speeches or drew attention to himself. He simply watched from a quiet corner, smiling as the children played. It had become his favorite part of the week. The man who once lived for deals and power now found peace in something money couldn't buy: joy. One afternoon, after the last student left, Maria stayed behind to tidy up. The room was bathed in golden sunlight, dust floating gently in the air. She sat at the piano and began to play softly, letting her fingers dance across the keys. The tune was new, gentle, hopeful, and full of gratitude. It was the kind of music that made people close their eyes and breathe deeper. Ethan stepped into the room quietly, listening. He didn't want to interrupt her. The melody wrapped around him like a warm blanket, carrying the story of their journey, from arrogance to humility, from mockery to meaning. When she finished, she turned and smiled. "You came early today," he chuckled softly. "I couldn't stay away. The music keeps pulling me back." She laughed lightly. "It has a way of doing that." For a moment they both stood in comfortable silence, listening to the echoes of the piano. Then Ethan said, "Do you remember the first time I asked you to play?" Maria nodded, her expression softening. "Yes, I was terrified." "I know," he said quietly. "And I was foolish. I thought I was proving something that night. I didn't realize I was the one who needed to learn." She smiled kindly. "We both learned something, I think," he nodded. "Yes, you taught me that real talent, real beauty, doesn't care about status. It just exists." Maria looked down at the piano keys. "Music doesn't care who you are. It only asks that you feel." He smiled faintly. "And you made me feel, for the first time in years." Her cheeks warmed, but she didn't reply. The next few weeks brought even more change. Donations started coming in from people who had heard about the school. Some wanted to help buy more instruments. Others offered to volunteer. What had started as one small act of kindness had turned into a movement of generosity. Maria was grateful, but she never took credit. Whenever someone tried to praise her, she would say, "This place exists because someone believed when I didn't." Ethan always smiled when he heard that. He didn't need recognition. Seeing the light in her eyes was enough. One evening, he asked Maria to join him for dinner at a small restaurant near the school. It wasn't fancy, just a cozy place with soft lighting and quiet music. Over dinner, they talked about the students, the lessons, and the future. "I think the school is ready for something bigger," Ethan said thoughtfully. "Maybe another branch." "More children?" Maria looked surprised. "That would be amazing, but are you sure?" "It's a lot of work," he smiled. "I'm sure. You once said you wanted to reach every child who couldn't afford to learn. Let's make that happen." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," he said softly. "Every time I hear those children play, it reminds me that I didn't waste my life chasing empty things." She smiled through her tears. "You didn't waste it. You just needed to find where your heart belonged." Ethan looked at her with quiet gratitude. "And you helped me find it." In that moment, it was clear that what connected them wasn't wealth or charity. It was something deeper. A shared understanding of what it meant to be human, to fall, to grow, and to find light in unexpected places. The following year, The second branch of the school opened in a small town nearby. It was simpler, smaller, but full of the same love and purpose. Maria traveled there once a week to train new teachers. Her reputation as a kind, gifted instructor spread, but she never changed. She still greeted every student with warmth and treated each one as if they were her own. Ethan watched her with pride, realizing that her success brought him more peace than any of his business achievements ever had. One morning, he received an envelope in the mail. Inside was an invitation. The city wanted to honor Maria with an award for her contribution to music education. Ethan smiled when he read it. That evening, he called her into his office. "You're being honored next week," he said, handing her the envelope. Her eyes widened. "What? No, I don't deserve that." "Yes, you do," he said firmly. "You've changed lives, Maria. This isn't about fame. It's about gratitude." She shook her head. "I never did any of this alone," he smiled. "Maybe not. But you were the heart that kept it alive." When the day of the ceremony came, the hall was filled with students, parents, teachers, and guests. The children played a short piece together at the beginning, one of Maria's own compositions. The sound was imperfect but full of joy, and it moved nearly everyone in the audience. When Maria's name was called, she walked onto the stage slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Ethan sat in the front row, watching with quiet pride. As she accepted the award, she said simply, "This isn't just mine. It belongs to every child who believed in themselves and to the man who reminded me that kindness can change everything." The audience applauded warmly. Ethan lowered his head for a moment, touched by her words. After the ceremony, people surrounded Maria to congratulate her, but she eventually slipped away to the quiet hallway outside. Ethan found her there, standing by a window. She turned and smiled when she saw him. "I hope I didn't embarrass you by mentioning you." He shook his head. "You could never embarrass me. You made me proud." For a while they stood there, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "You know," he said softly, "the night I first asked you to play the piano, I thought I was mocking you. I thought I was showing power. But I see now I was being shown grace." Maria's eyes softened. "Life has a strange way of teaching us, doesn't it?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, and I'm still learning." A comfortable silence followed. Then Maria said, "Thank you for everything, sir. You didn't just change my life. You gave me a reason to believe again." Ethan smiled faintly. "You gave me one too." As the years passed, the school continued to grow. More children joined, more teachers were trained, and the music reached places they had never imagined. Ethan gradually stepped back from his business empire, focusing instead on the foundation they had built together. He often spent mornings walking through the classrooms, greeting the children and listening to the sounds of practice. Their laughter filled him with peace. One day, as he sat in the small garden outside the school, Maria joined him with 2 cups of tea. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked with a smile. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not even a little. I thought success was about being known. Now I know it's about being remembered for kindness." Maria smiled. "Then you'll be remembered for a long time." He chuckled. "I think we both will." They sat quietly sipping tea as the soft sound of piano notes drifted from an open window nearby. The children were practicing one of Maria's new songs, a tune that spoke of hope, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Ethan listened, his eyes reflecting the soft afternoon light. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Maria nodded. "It's called The Second Chance," he smiled gently. A fitting name. As the melody floated through the air, they both realized how far they had come. 2 people from different worlds, bound by one simple truth: kindness could heal what pride had broken. And though their story began with mockery, it ended with music, the kind that stays in the heart long after the final note fades.